This should have been just another flight, another red-eye from Los Angeles, another hazy arrival at JFK International Airport. Just one more checkpoint between missions, between cities, between lives. For most travelers, airports are forgettable, liminal spaces filled with loudspeaker announcements, overpriced coffee, and the low-grade stress of missed connections. But for Naen Campbell, airports were something else entirely. They were stages, they were battlegrounds, and they were mirrors reflecting who people really were when no one was supposed to be watching. Naen had long since learned that the way a person held their passport, the way they scanned the crowd, the way they tensed as they approached security, those little things said more than words ever could. People revealed their truths when they thought they were anonymous, and anonymity was her gift. She stepped off the jet bridge into the terminal, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The air was thick with recycled chill, the scent of scorched espresso and bleach. JFK was alive, buzzing with early morning energy, pulsing with tension. But she was steady, calm, invisible. On the surface, she looked like anyone else. Sweatshirt, jeans, no makeup. Just another woman trying to make it home. But beneath the soft cotton fabric and calm expression was a mind honed by years of training. A body accustomed to danger, a heart carrying the weight of too many missions, too many masks. In her pocket, her phone buzzed once. She checked the screen. "Good work, Naen. Report to HQ when you land." That was it. The job was done. No confetti, no medals, just a text and a quiet nod from the shadows. She allowed herself a breath, not quite a sigh, not quite relief, just stillness. But as she made her way through the terminal, something shifted. It was subtle, a ripple in the atmosphere, a prickling sensation like static against skin. Someone was watching her. And not in the way security watches a crowd. No, this was targeted, intentional. She didn't stop, didn't look. But her senses lit up like a flare. Years of undercover work had trained her to notice the smallest things, reflections in glass, weight in the air, silence where there should be sound. She saw him just as she passed a Starbucks, a man in uniform, airport and police. Standing too still, coffee in one hand, radio in the other, but his eyes were locked on her, not casually, not professionally, with suspicion, with purpose. His name tag read Mendes. And even before he took a step toward her, Naen knew this wasn't going to be just another layover. This wasn't routine. This was personal. And what neither of them knew in that moment, what they couldn't have known, is that this encounter, this tiny spark of confrontation, would ignite something far bigger than either of them imagined. Because when you target the wrong woman for the wrong reasons, you don't just start a fight. You wake up the storm. And Naen Campbell? She doesn't back down. She never has. She never will. The hum of the terminal continued like background noise, familiar, almost soothing. But under the surface, something had shifted. None didn't break her stride. Her boots made soft contact with the tiled floor, her suitcase gliding silently behind her. Her posture was relaxed, even casual. But inside, she was already calculating. A lifetime of training had taught her to listen to the body before the mind could catch up, and her body was telling her something was wrong. She kept walking, past the newsstand, past the sushi kiosk, eyes ahead scanning overhead signs that pointed toward ground transportation. But with every step, the weight on her back grew heavier. She didn't need to look to know. He was following. It wasn't just suspicion, it was certainty. That officer, the one with the too tight posture and eyes like stone, was behind her now. She could feel his gaze, not curious, not cautious. Predatory. Then came the voice. Firm, clipped, commanding. "Ma'am, excuse me." Naen stopped. She turned slowly, deliberately. Not like prey, not like someone caught off guard. Her face was a mask of calm, unreadable. The one she wore when she was undercover in rooms full of men who would kill her if they knew who she really was. The officer stood just a few feet away, blue eyes hard beneath a furrowed brow. His badge gleamed against his dark uniform. Mendes. Up close, his presence was louder than his voice, overconfidence barely hiding the flicker of something uglier beneath. Naen didn't flinch. "Yes, officer?" Mendes looked her up and down in a way that wasn't procedural. It was something else, a slow, intentional sweep, like he was trying to find something wrong, something to justify what he already believed. "I need to see your ID and boarding pass." No greeting, no explanation, just demand. Naen's grip on her suitcase handle tightened, barely. "I'm sorry?" she asked, tone level, calm but with weight. "May I ask why?" Mendes didn't blink. Random inspection. It was a lie, she knew it, he knew it. But he didn't care. Men like Mendes never did. She could have called him on it right then. Could have pulled her badge, ended the charade, watched him stumble over his own arrogance, but she didn't. Because pulling the badge would have ended more than the conversation. It would have ended her window into the truth. So she reached into her bag and handed him the ID. Naen Walker, legal consultant, Washington, D.C., a flawless alias, months in the making, every detail precise. He took it from her slowly, as if expecting it to reveal something hidden, flipped it, studied it, then almost reluctantly handed it back. "What kind of consulting?" he asked. Naen gave a small, polite smile. "Legal research, mostly sensitive documents." His mouth twitched at the word sensitive, as if it confirmed whatever bias had formed the moment he laid eyes on her. He scribbled something in a small notebook, then, "I'm gonna need to take a look at your bags." There it was, the slow tightening around her ribs, the pressure of a choice. She had nothing to hide. Her bag was clean, scrubbed of anything linking her to the bureau, but that wasn't the point. It wasn't about her belongings, it was about her. She took a breath, let it settle her. "I just came through TSA," she said evenly. "Is there a specific reason you're conducting a second search?" "It's a routine check," Mendes snapped. "If you've got nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem." The smile never reached her lips this time. She had heard that line before, in alleyways, at border crossings, in interrogation rooms dressed up as interviews. It was never really about what you were carrying, it was about making you feel small. But Naen Campbell had never been small. She nodded slowly. "All right, but can we do this somewhere private?" Mendes didn't like that. She saw it in the way his jaw tensed. He'd been hoping she'd refuse, hoping for a scene, but she wasn't giving it to him. He gestured for her to follow. They moved through the terminal together. Passengers hurried past, oblivious. The world kept spinning, unaware of the battle unfolding in silence. Naen walked behind him, her steps sure, every detail logged, every movement memorized. She didn't know exactly what Mendes was trying to prove, but she was starting to understand something deeper. This wasn't just a power trip. This was personal. And somewhere behind the badge and the uniform, behind the authority and the smirk, was a man who couldn't stand the fact that she didn't flinch, and wouldn't. Not now, not ever. Naen walked away from the private corridor, her bag zipped and returned to her hand, her cover intact, but her calm slightly cracked. Mendes hadn't found anything, of course. There was nothing to find. Her identity, her work, her mission, it had all been carefully scrubbed and sanitized long before wheels touched the tarmac. But what lingered wasn't relief. It was something more insidious, disgust. Not just at Mendes, but at the familiarity of it all. The subtle grind of control disguised as procedure, the way he stood too close, the tone he used. The assumption that she didn't belong, that she needed to be put in her place. She knew it wasn't over, not with men like him. They didn't just stop at one interaction, they circled, tested, prodded, waited for you to slip. Still, she told herself, the moment had passed. But as she rounded the corner near the central concourse, her breath caught. It hadn't passed. It had only shifted. There, just a few dozen feet ahead, stood Mendes again. This time his attention wasn't on her. It was on someone else. A young man, barely 20 maybe, brown skin, nervous hands clutching a tattered backpack against his chest. His eyes darted from Mendes to the surrounding crowd, unsure whether to run or stay rooted in place. Mendes stood tall and stiff, his voice louder than necessary. "Let me see your passport." I don't have it," the young man stammered. I'm a U.S. citizen. I have my driver's license. Mendes sneered. I didn't ask for your license. I said passport. People passed by, some glanced and then looked away. Others didn't notice at all. That was the way of airports. Chaos made it easy to hide cruelty. Naen stopped. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Her instinct told her to stay quiet, to walk away, to protect her cover. But her heart said otherwise. She stepped forward. Officer Mendes. Her voice cut through the tension like a clean break in glass. Calm, controlled, but impossible to ignore. Mendes turned sharply. The recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by irritation, then a flicker of something colder. You again, he muttered. That's right, Naen said, stopping a few feet from him. I just saw you 20 minutes ago. Now I'm watching you do the same thing to someone else. This doesn't concern you, he said tightly. She tilted her head, eyes locked on his. Actually, it does, because you're harassing people without probable cause. That's twice now, both people of color. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. For a moment, the air felt charged, crackling with the threat of confrontation. Mendes's jaw twitched. His hand rested too tightly on his belt. The young man looked between them, frozen in disbelief. Then, from the periphery, another figure approached, Officer Morales. Naen had seen him earlier, loitering near Mendes during her own stop. He hadn't intervened then, but now? Now his face held something different. Unease. Hey, Mendes, Morales said softly. Let this one go. Mendes glared at him. What? You hurt me, Morales said, voice firmer now. It's not worth it. Mendes looked between Naen, the young man, and Morales. His pride visibly chafed, his authority challenged. He shoved the young man's ID back at him with a scowl. Fine. Relief broke across the boy's face as he stepped back, murmuring a quick, shaky, thank you, to Naen before slipping into the crowd. Mendes didn't move, he just stared at her. You think you're a hero? He said, low enough that only she could hear. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Naen didn't blink. I don't need to be a hero, she replied. Just someone who's watching. He stared at her for another second, then he turned and walked away. Naen stood still in the middle of the terminal, her pulse high, her hands still tight. Around her, life went on. Flights were called, announcements made, people bustled by with coffee and carry-ons. But she knew something had changed. She wasn't just passing through JFK anymore. She had stepped into something bigger, and she'd just become part of a story that was no longer just her own. The SUV was waiting right where the message said it would be, black, clean, unmarked. A quiet shadow against the busy curb outside JFK. Naen stepped into the passenger seat and shut the door behind her with a quiet finality. The hum of the city vanished once she was inside. In its place, silence, thick and waiting. Daniel Park didn't say anything right away. He just glanced at her, reading her face like a man who'd known her long enough to skip the pleasantries. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the rearview mirror, more out of habit than suspicion. Finally, he asked, You good? Naen leaned her head back for a second, exhaled through her nose. Yeah. A pause, then Park raised an eyebrow. That didn't sound like a yes. She gave a half-laugh, the kind that carried no amusement, because it wasn't. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of honking cabs and travelers dragging their lives behind them in suitcases. Outside, everything was still moving. Inside, it felt like time had slowed. I ran into someone, she said after a moment. Airport police, Officer Mendes. Park glanced at her again, sharper this time. Ran into or got flagged by? Flagged, she confirmed. Pulled me for a random inspection. Went through my bag, asked questions he had no reason to ask. Tried to get into my laptop. Park's grip on the wheel tightened, just slightly. He find anything? No, I'm clean, but that's not what this was about. She turned to face the window. It was about me. Park didn't speak for a few seconds. When he did, his voice was low. You want to file a complaint? Naen hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? Filing meant stepping into the spotlight, lifting the veil. She'd no longer just be Naen Walker, the legal consultant. She'd be Naen Campbell, federal agent, calling out abuse from within a system that rarely thanked you for doing so. She crossed her arms, still staring out the window. I'm not sure it would change anything. Park didn't respond right away. He gave her the space to say what she needed, or not say it at all. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried weight. You think the system's too broken to fix? Naen smiled, sad and small. I think there are cracks so deep we forget they're there until someone falls in. And Mendes? He asked. She turned back toward him, her voice quieter now. He's not just a crack. He's the kind of man who widens them, who thrives in them. Park nodded, understanding settling between them like fog. But here's the thing, she added, eyes narrowing slightly. He wasn't just harassing me. After he let me go, I watched him go after a kid. Brown skin, scared eyes, no passport. Mendes cornered him like he was already guilty. Park frowned. Did you step in? Yeah, she said softly. I had to. He nodded again, slower this time. So maybe the question isn't whether filing a complaint changes everything. Maybe the question is, how many more people like him get away with it if we don't? Naen didn't answer, not immediately, because deep down she already knew the answer. She closed her eyes for a moment, her mind flashing back to the young man clutching his backpack, to the way Mendes stared like a predator with too much confidence, too much protection. This wasn't about pride anymore, or even protocol. It was about something bigger. She opened her eyes. Maybe, she said at last. I just need to think about it. Park didn't push. He never did. That was what made him different from most of the bureau. But as the SUV turned onto the highway and the city skyline loomed in the distance, Naen realized something else. She wasn't just thinking. She was preparing. The next morning, the sky over Manhattan was still a deep, bruised gray when Naen arrived at the field office. The city hadn't quite woken up yet, but inside the building, the lights were already humming. Agents already buried in reports, phones already ringing. She moved through the familiar halls with the practiced ease of someone who belonged but rarely lingered. She'd never been one to loiter around the office. For years, her work had kept her in the shadows, covert operations, off-the-grid investigations. But today was different. Today, she had come back for something more personal. She took the stairs instead of the elevator, as if movement might help her think, or maybe keep her from feeling too much. Her mind was still replaying the moment at the airport, the weight in Mendes's voice, the way he said, "You have no idea who you're dealing with." She did now. She knocked lightly on the glass door marked Special Agent Victoria Reese. A voice called. Naen stepped inside. Victoria Reese stood behind her desk, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hair streaked with silver and pulled into a loose bun. She looked up with a small, familiar smile, the kind that didn't need words to say, "I've been expecting you." "Thought you'd stop by sooner," Reese said, motioning for her to sit. Naen offered a faint grin. "Took me a night to decide whether I was mad or just tired," Reese chuckled, sitting across from her. "And I'm both." That earned a nod of approval. "Good. That's when the real work starts." There was a silence between them for a moment, comfortable, lived in. Reese had been one of Naen's earliest mentors years ago. She'd taught her how to lead without barking, how to watch without blinking, how to speak without giving away the whole game. And more than that, she'd taught her how to survive in a world that didn't always welcome women like them. "I heard about JFK," Reese said finally. "Of course she had. Got flagged by an officer named Mendes," Naen said. "Tried to pretend it was routine. It wasn't." Reese leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting, thoughtful, alert. "You file anything yet?" "No," Naen replied. "I needed to be sure." "And now?" "I'm sure." Reese gave a small nod, then reached for her tablet. "You know what happens next, right?" "Yeah." "You'll be asked to go on record. You'll be asked to testify if it goes that far. You might lose your cover status for a while, and if Mendes has friends, and I promise you he does, they'll make noise." "I know." Reese studied her for a moment, then spoke with quiet precision. "I looked into your Officer Mendes." Naen sat straighter. "And?" "He's dirty," Reese said. "Not in the obvious way. He plays smart, stays just within the lines. But I've found at least 4 official complaints against him: excessive force, profiling, one incident with a teenage boy who ended up hospitalized, another with an Iraqi vet returning home. All dismissed, quietly, buried." Naen clenched her jaw. "So he's protected." "Very," Reese confirmed. "He was transferred to airport duty 5 years ago after an internal investigation with NYPD. Paper trail's thin, but you don't get that kind of immunity without help." Naen stared at the floor for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't even just about Mendes. This was about a system designed to preserve men like him, to look the other way when the warning signs flashed in neon. Reese leaned forward. "So, you want to push this?" Naen looked up, eyes steady, voice clear. "Yes?" There it was, not hesitation, not curiosity, conviction. Reese sat back, her gaze softening. "Then we start with the complaints. I'll call in a few favors, see what we can unearth. But Naen, if we go down this road, there's no halfway." "I'm not interested in halfway," she said. And she meant it, because something had changed in her, something fundamental. For years, she'd moved in silence, done her work in shadows. But this time, she didn't want to disappear after the case was done. This time, she wanted to be seen. This time, she wanted Mendes to know that someone was coming for him. And not just someone, her. Naen arrived at JFK 2 hours early, not for a flight, not for a mission. She was there to watch, to listen, to learn. The crowd surged around her as they always did. Families dragging sleepy toddlers, business people glued to their phones, elderly travelers clutching boarding passes with nervous fingers. Airports were the great equalizers. Everyone passed through the same doors, but not everyone was treated the same. Naen moved through security like any other traveler. Boarding pass, ID, shoes off, bags scanned, all without issue. No secondary screening, no suspicious stares, just a clean, quiet process. It felt eerie, because this time Mendes wasn't waiting for her. At least, not yet. She bought herself a coffee, black, too bitter, and took a seat by the wide terminal windows overlooking the runways. The early morning light glinted off the metal wings of parked planes. They looked peaceful out there, preparing to carry people somewhere else. Somewhere safer, maybe. But Naen wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. She sipped the coffee slowly, letting the heat ground her. Then, there it was again. That weight, that prickle at the back of her neck. She didn't need to look to know. He was here. She saw his reflection in the glass before she turned. Officer Mendes walking with purpose through the terminal, his uniform crisp, his eyes sweeping the crowd. Not searching for danger. Hunting. And then, as if by instinct, he found her. Their eyes met. There was no surprise on his face, just tension, and something colder underneath. Recognition. He altered his path and walked straight toward her. Naen didn't move, didn't blink. She placed her coffee on the table beside her and straightened in her seat. "Let him come." "Miss Walker," Mendes said as he approached, his voice almost cordial, almost amused. "Back again." Naen crossed her arms. "It's an airport. People tend to pass through them." He glanced at her carry-on bag. "You fly a lot for a legal consultant. It's a busy season." A pause. His eyes narrowed. "Where to this time?" She tilted her head. "Didn't realize I needed to submit a travel itinerary to airport security." The smirk on his face didn't reach his eyes. "Just making sure no one slips through the cracks." There was a crowd nearby, passengers seated, standing, checking screens, but the air around them felt like a closed room, silent, compressed, dangerous. "Let me see your ticket," Mendes said, holding out a hand. Naen's jaw clenched, not because she had anything to hide, but because she saw the trap for what it was. Power, flexed for no reason other than to see if she would break. She reached into her pocket slowly and handed him the boarding pass. He took his time reading it. "Seat 14A, he said aloud. "Departing at 9:45. You do know passengers are supposed to wait at their gates, right? Not just linger?" Naen gave a slow, deliberate smile. "It's a public terminal, officer. I can sit where I like." He didn't like that. She saw it in the way his mouth twitched, the way his jaw locked, the way his fingers curled ever so slightly at his sides. "Watch your tone," he said under his breath. Naen didn't blink. "Watch your badge." For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then Mendes leaned in, just enough for his next words to sting like venom. "You think you're making a point, but people like you..." He paused, his smile twisting. "You always end up learning the hard way." Naen felt her pulse rise, but she refused to give him what he wanted. She stood slowly, took her ticket from his hand, and stepped around him. "Have a nice day, officer." And then she walked away. Not fast, not flustered, just forward. Behind her, she could still feel his gaze, heavy, venomous, unresolved. But something had shifted in the air. This wasn't a private tension anymore. Passengers had watched. A few whispered. Some had phones out. The game was no longer invisible. And men like Mendes? They hated being seen. Naen knew this wasn't the end of it. But maybe, just maybe, It was the beginning of the end. The call came the next morning just after sunrise. Naen was still halfway through her first cup of coffee, staring out the window of her apartment, when her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something in her gut told her to answer. Naen Campbell? The voice on the other end was deep, steady, and familiar in a way that made her stomach tighten. This is Henry Briggs. We met yesterday at the airport. Of course, the older gentleman Mendes had singled out, calm, composed, until Mendes reduced him to yet another man trying to justify his right to exist. Naen straightened. "Mr. Briggs, I remember. Are you okay?" A pause, then, "Yes, I am now, and I wanted to thank you." "You don't have to." "I do," he said gently, "because if you hadn't stepped in, I don't know how far he would have gone." His voice wavered just slightly, enough for her to hear the exhaustion beneath the surface, the kind that came from decades of pushing back against the same wall. "I've seen his type before," Briggs continued, "but I've never seen one so bold, so sure that nothing would happen to him." Naen's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "Do you want to file a formal complaint?" she asked. Another pause. "I do, but not alone." "You won't be," she said. "I promise." And she meant it. They met that afternoon in a quiet corner of a small Manhattan cafe, tucked away from the noise, the kind of place that felt safe without trying to be. Briggs arrived in a charcoal coat, briefcase in hand, posture still proud despite the strain in his eyes. They sat down across from each other and he opened the case slowly, revealing a stack of carefully kept documents, notes, articles, a list of names. "I've been digging," he said. "Ever since yesterday. I'm a corporate lawyer. I know how these things work. But this?" He shook his head. "This is deeper than I expected." Naen scanned the papers. They weren't just complaints. They were stories, encounters. Moments like hers, like his, like that young man with the backpack, written down by people who had tried to speak up. Most had been ignored. Some had been paid to stay quiet. And every single one had been handled by the same law firm, Garrett, Lawson, and Associates. Naen felt the name settle like a weight in her chest. "I've heard of them," she murmured. "They specialize in protecting law enforcement in civil misconduct cases," Briggs said. "And Mendes? He's not just a client." Naen looked up. "What do you mean?" Briggs pulled out one more file. "He's their enforcer." Her brow furrowed. "Explain." Briggs leaned in, voice low, almost disbelieving his own words. "I found at least 3 officers who filed internal complaints against co-workers, against corruption. And guess what happened next?" Naen already knew, but she let him say it. Mendes showed up at their homes, at their cars, pulled them in for routine questioning, detained them, intimidated them into silence. A chill moved down her spine, not from fear, from clarity. She was looking at more than a corrupt officer. She was looking at a tool, a weapon. Mendes hadn't just been protected, he had been used, and willingly. This firm, Lawson's firm, they cover up the messes, make settlements disappear, scrub records. But if someone tries to fight back, Briggs closed the folder. They send him. Naen stared at the name again. Garrett Lawson. A man with no badge, no gun, but more dangerous than either. "You're sure about all this?" she asked. Briggs nodded slowly. "As sure as I've ever been." Naen leaned back in her chair, her mind already turning, connecting threads, names, patterns. This wasn't just a story of one man's abuse of power. This was a system, a machine, built to silence, to punish, to protect its own. But machines can be dismantled. And systems, they can be exposed. Naen met Briggs's eyes and said, "Then we bring it all down." The night was quiet, too quiet. Naen had spent years walking into dangerous rooms, crossing borders under cover, shaking hands with men whose smiles masked blood. She knew what fear looked like, what it smelled like, what it sounded like in the silence before a strike. But this was different. She was in her own apartment, a place she'd designed to feel safe. Neutral walls, warm lighting, a plant she barely remembered to water, books she'd never finish, a place where she could drop the persona and just be. And yet her instincts were screaming. She paced the floor, phone in hand, eyes flicking to the windows every few seconds. Earlier that evening, a black sedan had parked across the street, no plates she could see, no movement. But the presence? Heavy. Her phone buzzed. "Daniel Park." "Tell me you're inside," he said without greeting. "I am. I'm on my way. Stay put." She paused. "You think he's coming?" Park didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. "He's already there, isn't he?" Naen turned toward the window. The driver's side door of the sedan opened. A figure stepped out. Casual clothes, leather jacket, gloves, no badge.
No.
But she knew that frame, that walk. Mendes. He crossed the street with slow, deliberate steps, head down like a man with no intention of being seen, only feared. Naen didn't run. She didn't hide. She moved, gun holstered at her hip, phone in her pocket, her breathing slow and steady. When the knock came, it wasn't frantic. It was soft, like a whisper asking to be let in. Then came the voice. "Miss Walker." She froze, not because of fear, but because of fury. He knew her real name. He knew everything now. "I think we got off on the wrong foot," Mendes called through the door. His voice was calm, controlled. The kind of calm that made her skin crawl. "You need to leave," she called back. He laughed, just once, a sharp, joyless bark. "I don't think you understand how much trouble you've caused." The doorknob jiggled, locked, but that didn't stop him. With a sudden crash, her door burst inward, wood splintering beneath brute force. Mendes stepped through like a ghost from a nightmare, gun in hand. But Naen was already moving. She ducked behind this couch, drawing her weapon, breath measured. The sound of a shot rang out, sharp and violent. It hit the wall just inches from where her head had been. Another shot. She returned fire, once, loud, controlled. It grazed his shoulder. He stumbled, cursed, dropped behind her kitchen island, breathing hard now. "This is how you end it," he shouted, hiding behind furniture like a coward. She kept silent. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. Another shot, another miss. "You think people like you change anything?" Mendes snarled. "You're a blip, a footnote. They'll erase this, like they erased everything else." Naen rose slowly from cover, her gun steady, pointed directly at the counter where she could see the shadow of his shoulder. "I'm not a footnote," she said. "I'm the last person you'll ever try to intimidate." She moved swiftly, one step, two. Mendes popped up to fire again. Too late. She pulled the trigger. A single shot. This time she didn't miss. He fell hard, his gun clattering to the floor as he clutched his arm, blood soaking through his jacket. Sirens blared in the distance. Back up. Too late to stop what had happened, but not too late to finish it. As agents poured into the apartment, weapons drawn, Mendes was already crumpled against the floor, defeated, panting, glaring. Naen holstered her weapon and stood over him. "You should have stayed in the shadows," he hissed. She looked down at him, calm, resolute. "That's what men like you count on," she said. "People like me staying silent, but not this time." As they dragged him away in cuffs, Mendes didn't scream, didn't fight, but he looked back at her one last time. And in his eyes, not fear, not rage, resentment, because deep down he knew, this time he'd lost. The headlines hit the next morning. Not front page yet, but loud enough to echo. "Airport officer suspended amid allegations of abuse, FBI investigating." Sources confirm witness intimidation, excessive force under review. Pattern of profiling emerges at JFK Terminal. They didn't use Mendes's name at first, but those who needed to know, they knew. Naen stood by the windows of the field office, coffee growing cold in her hands, watching the city crawl into motion below. The world hadn't stopped. People were still catching trains, answering emails, buying bagels. But in this building, something had shifted. It was subtle. A longer silence when she entered a room, a glance that lingered just a beat too long, respect maybe, or something like caution. Reese appeared beside her, arms folded, gaze sharp. "You did good," she said softly. Naen didn't respond right away. Her eyes stayed fixed on the skyline. "This isn't over," she murmured. Reese nodded. "No, but it started." The night before had ended in chaos, sirens, paramedics, evidence bags. Mendes had been taken into custody, his blood still fresh on the floor of her apartment. He'd tried to walk out with dignity, but it was gone. Left behind with the splinters of her door. They had him, finally. But the moment he was booked, something strange began to happen. Phones started ringing, quiet calls, pressured requests, people asking for details, for reassurances. People who had never cared about her work suddenly very interested in her well-being. And then the records started coming in, complaints that had been marked lost, incomplete, inconclusive. Now they were resurfacing. Briggs called her that morning. "They're coming forward," he said. Others, men, women, all colors, all ages, travelers, employees, even one former officer. Naen closed her eyes for a beat. How many? Too many to ignore, Briggs said. The machine was cracking. The law firm that had protected Mendes, Garrett Lawson and Associates, was now in the Bureau's crosshairs, their case history being pulled apart. Settlement agreements reviewed, internal correspondence subpoenaed. It was moving fast, almost too fast. Reese laid a file on the table beside her. Lawson's people are rattled, she said. They've started erasing emails. We're locking down what we can, but they know this is real now. Naen opened the folder. Dozens of cases. Names she didn't know. Faces she hadn't seen. And one thing in common, each of them silenced, buried, or pushed out after raising a hand against misconduct. This wasn't an isolated officer. It never had been. Mendes was just the face of something deeper, something older. But now that something was bleeding light, you should take a break, Reese said gently. You've done more than enough. Naen shook her head. No, not yet. Reese studied her for a long second, then nodded, stepping back. All right, but stay smart. Desperate men do desperate things. Naen didn't reply, because she wasn't thinking about Mendes anymore. She was thinking about every officer who had looked the other way, every lawyer who made excuses, every system that was designed to protect power instead of people. They'd made a mistake when they came after her, because they thought she'd be scared. They thought she'd stay quiet. They thought she'd walk away after the first victory. But Naen Campbell didn't want headlines. She wanted accountability, and she was just getting started. There was a strange quiet in the FBI field office that morning, not the kind that came from calm, but the kind that follows after an earthquake. The kind where everyone's still standing, but the floor beneath them doesn't quite feel stable anymore. Naen sat in one of the glass conference rooms, the door half closed, a stack of files untouched in front of her. Her coffee had gone cold again. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than it should have. Briggs's voice played back in her head. Lawson isn't just defending cops, he's cultivating them. She hadn't wanted to believe it at first, but the more she saw, the more names surfaced, the more stories unfolded, the more it became undeniable. This wasn't about Mendes anymore. He was the fist, but someone else had made him into one. She rubbed her eyes, leaning back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as if it might answer the questions circling inside her. How deep does it go? The door creaked open, and Reese stepped in with a manila folder in her hand. Thought you'd want to see this. Naen sat up, taking the file. Inside were transcripts, phone records, notes from interviews. A clear thread was starting to emerge. Too many similar cases, too many buried reports, officers who had spoken up, then vanished from records. Lawsuits settled with gag orders, victims paid off and silenced. One firm linked them all, Garrett Lawson and Associates. Naen flipped through the pages, her face unreadable. They've built an entire legal shield, Reese said quietly. They're not just defending bad cops, they're creating the conditions where abuse becomes strategy. Naen looked up. How long has this been happening? Reese hesitated. At least a decade, maybe more. But the Mendes connection is the key. He's not just one of their clients, he was used as a tool, a message. Naen's jaw clenched. To keep others in line. Yes, Reese confirmed. To make people afraid of speaking up. To remind them the system protects itself. There was a long silence between them. Naen closed the folder, hands still on the cover. I knew this wasn't just about him, she said softly. But I didn't realize how much they'd normalized it. How many people had to look the other way for this to keep going. That's how systems survive, Reese replied. Not just through cruelty, but through silence. Naen leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice lower now. He said something the night he broke in. Right before I took him down, he said, you think this is about me? I was never the real problem. Reese gave a slow, grim nod. He wasn't wrong. That's what haunted her the most. Mendes had been a monster, but a monster with purpose. He was part of a design. And for every man like him exposed, how many more were out there, still protected, still working, still hurting people under the cloak of policy? Naen stood, walking over to the window. The sun had finally pushed through the clouds, casting long strips of light across the office floor. But even in the warmth, she felt the weight of what was coming. This fight wasn't just about one arrest. It wasn't about headlines or suspension notices or statements to the press. It was about the people who had been told they didn't matter. The people who'd stopped believing justice was even possible. And the people who had built entire careers ensuring it stayed that way. "I want everything," Naen said quietly. "Every officer linked to Lawson's firm, every case they buried, every person who tried to come forward and was shut down." Reese nodded. "Already started." Naen turned back, her voice no longer soft. "Then we're not stopping until they all fall." Weeks passed, not in silence but in steady, relentless noise, the noise of justice unraveling a carefully protected machine. Naen didn't go back to field duty, not right away. She stayed close to the investigation, attending interviews, reviewing case files, giving her statement on record not once but twice. She sat across from lawyers who tried to minimize, bureaucrats who tried to excuse, and officers who tried to pretend they hadn't known what was happening. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The evidence did that for her. Mendes was charged, formally and publicly, not just for what happened in her apartment, but for a years-long pattern of abuse and intimidation, all backed by internal memos, sealed settlements, and the stories of people who had finally found the courage to speak. Garrett Lawson was next. His firm collapsed under the weight of exposure. Clients dropped him. The bar opened disciplinary hearings. His name, once whispered in courtrooms like a protective spell, was now synonymous with corruption. And those who had hidden behind him, they began to fall, one by one. By the end of the month, 3 officers had been suspended, 2 more retired early, a dozen more cases were reopened. The Civilian Complaint Review Board released a report. Local news picked it up, then national. The story spread, but for Naen, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like air after too many years underwater. She sat on a park bench one afternoon, the kind of quiet New York moment that didn't come often. A breeze brushing against her cheek, children laughing in the distance, the sun warming her back. Her phone buzzed. Text from Henry Briggs, "We did it, you lit the match." She smiled faintly. He was wrong, of course. She hadn't lit the match. She just refused to let it go out. Park joined her a few minutes later, 2 coffees in hand. He didn't say anything as he handed one over, just sat beside her the way he always did, quiet, steady, present. "You still thinking about going back under?" he asked eventually. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure I can disappear again, not after all this." He nodded, understanding. "You don't have to, not anymore." She sipped the coffee, let the moment stretch. "You ever wonder," she said, "how many people this happened to? Before us? Before phones? Before hashtags? Before it was even called profiling?" Park glanced at her. "All the time." She nodded, voice lower now. "It's not just about fixing one cop or one precinct. It's about showing people that silence isn't the only option, that sometimes one voice can hold the line." Park looked at her then, really looked at her. "You're not the kind of hero people expect, Naen." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind is that?" "The kind who doesn't want the spotlight, the kind who fights anyway." A soft wind stirred the leaves around their feet, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself breathe. Mendes had tried to reduce her to a target. The system had hoped she'd stay quiet, but she hadn't. And because of that, people were watching now. People were listening. Somewhere, someone boarding a flight would walk past security with a little less fear. Somewhere, a man like Briggs would be treated with dignity, not suspicion. Somewhere, an officer thinking about crossing the line might pause, remember her face, her name. Naen Campbell. Not a hero in a cape, not a symbol in a headline, just a woman who said no. And meant it. Because justice doesn't always come in sirens and verdicts. Sometimes it comes in the quiet, firm steps of someone refusing to look away.